Good afternoon, good morning to you all, and thank you for joining us at our inaugural Primerio event on an ever increasingly important sector. I think digital markets have significantly transformed the global economy. This exponential growth poses concerns for both policy and enforcement of competition law worldwide. Global enforcement efforts have focused on the promotion of competition through new antitrust policy, the establishment of new digital market regulators, and the review of killer acquisitions. Despite these developments, regulatory agencies continue to grapple with the way forward in regulating the digital economy. Many continue to question whether the rules need to change, and if so, how. Today's webinar is carefully structured to include discussions on the lessons learned from Europe, South Africa, Nigeria, and Kenya. Our panelists will discuss and consider whether current traditional antitrust is sufficient to address the digital economy. The OECD has recently recognized the impact of digitalization on the competitive dynamics of economies worldwide. The reports highlight how competition authorities continue to grapple with uncertainties in evolving digital markets as they are required to consider new forms of misconduct and abuse of dominance. These sessions reveal that many agencies now look to examine whether additional tools for competition policy are required or whether mere active use of existing tools are sufficient to address such concerns. Our very own South African Competition Commission is in no way unique in this regard, having increased its focus on digital markets, now considering this a priority sector. What does, however, differentiate South Africa's approach to enforcement is certain of the recommendations contained in our agency's recent report, Competition in the Digital Economy. The report comments that intentional regulation is required to avoid outcomes that could harm the development of small businesses, consumers, and ultimately economic growth so needed in developing South Africa's economy. More recently, in May 2021, the South African Commission posted draft guidelines regarding the notification of small mergers. The draft guidelines point out that in the context of digital markets, there are concerns that potentially anti-competitive acquisitions escape regulatory scrutiny. This is due to these acquisitions taking place at an early stage in the formation of the target entity, prior to it generating significant turnover sufficient enough to warrant merger notification. In addition, our agency has ever more recently published a provisional report following its investigations into the online intermediation platforms market. The report has highlighted its focus on inclusion of small, historically disadvantaged persons firms in the digital market. Quite clearly, there's a great deal to discuss. And in this regard, we are happy to have our friends at Primerio partner with us in organizing today's event. We also have an informed view from two business representatives, Juanita Clark, Digital Council Africa CEO, and co-founder and managing director of Frogfoot Networks, Abram van der Merwe. Both will guide us on the impact of perceived overregulation on investment. Florence Abebe, the Chief Legal Officer at the Nigerian Federal Competition and Consumer Protection Commission, and Raphael Maburu from the Mergers and Acquisitions Division of the Competition Authority of Kenya, will provide us with insight into the developments and trends in Nigeria and Kenya, respectively. Having two representatives from the most active competition agencies in Africa is significant. It will provide insight into the intended policy direction each agency will take. Trevor Soames, partner at Quinn Emanuel, and Mark English of Counsel at Quinn Emanuel will elaborate on the pitfalls and advances made in the regulation of digital markets by the competition agencies in the European Union. Online markets are massively important for economic growth in the African continent. Today's insights into existing South African and regional developments and lessons learned from our experienced European practitioners will spur significant discussion.
I want to kick off by perhaps giving an overarching view of what's taking place in South Africa. I think the digital markets debate and what the appropriate policy should be and the level of regulatory intervention is certainly something which is not confined to Europe and the United States and the more established economies, but it's at very much the forefront of what's going on in South Africa as well. And by way of some background and to give the audience some context into where we find ourselves, the Competition Commission published a policy paper in 2020 and highlighted and flagged several aspects of the digital market, which we think is important to highlight. Of course, they noted the general trend of killer acquisitions and the need to possibly refine the merger guidelines to ensure that transactions whereby nascent competitors are scrutinized in the digital space, and they've lowered those thresholds. Those are in the form of draft small merger guidelines, so they don't yet obligate parties who meet those thresholds to notify, but that is certainly going to be the trend. I think parties active in the digital space are going to be called on to more frequently notify even competitively benign transactions based on those thresholds. And I think we'll, throughout the course of this discussion, perhaps highlight some of the risks that might be associated with the trends in changing the merger control thresholds. I think importantly, the Commission has also recognized that in order for South Africa, and given its emerging market status and the sort of economic position of many South Africans, the need for infrastructure is essential in order to achieve and deliver the benefits of a digital market. And I think that's particularly why we're so interested to hear from Abram and Unita, who will be joining us shortly, and get their views on several aspects of the sort of infrastructure side of digital markets. And then the third, I think, key regulatory development at the moment is the online intermediation market inquiry. It's currently being conducted by the Competition Commission. They have published draft recommendations, and there are several features in those draft recommendations. Again, I reiterate, they're draft, they're open for public comment, and then by no means the final pronouncement on the remedial steps that they take. But based on the draft recommendations, there are some far-reaching recommendations contemplated, and it covers the breadth of search engines, food delivery, e-commerce, hotel and property apps and the like. So it's quite far-reaching, and I think it's not too dissimilar. Well, the concerns raised are perhaps not too dissimilar to what's been identified internationally. Concerns of self-preferencing and increasing barriers to entry for particularly small and medium businesses to participate meaningfully on those platforms. I think, speaking as a practitioner, we have identified several risks, potential risks, shall I say, associated with the market inquiry. I think fundamentally is a risk that the market inquiry powers changed quite substantively 2 years ago, whereas previously the Commission conducted market inquiries and then simply recommended remedial steps to be taken up by legislature or Parliament. Now the Commission has the powers to impose remedial actions or remedial measures themselves. Those include behavioral remedies. It also even includes structural remedies. And although the structural remedies need to be confirmed by the tribunal, the threshold upon which to assess whether features of the market are distorted is much lower than the standard substantial lessening of competition threshold. And it also mandates the Commission to assess the impact that the market or market features would have on the ability of a designated class of competitors, commonly termed historically disadvantaged persons in South Africa, or HDPs, and SMMEs, small medium enterprises, to participate meaningfully in the market. And I suppose we're sitting in a position where we're saying, well, if the market inquiries are used in a means that ensures the Commission fundamentally understands the different aspects of the digital economy, ranging from infrastructure to, let's say, platforms, and even within platforms, fundamentally understands how businesses within those platforms, what are the key investment and commercial decisions, we say that's very much welcomed. If, however, and I think there is a legitimate concern that the market inquiries follow or are premised on a big is bad principle, and I think there's a material risk that there could be over intervention, over regulation, and that the fundamental principles of sort of having an objective standard, one based on economic evidence and sort of one that's quantifiable, might well be compromised. So I think it would be unfair to suggest that the Commission has overstepped its mark. As I mentioned, the recommendations are very much in draft form, but certainly from what we've seen, we think that that's a notable risk. Having said that, the Commission has in their policy paper, and this comes to sort of John's earlier remarks, whether the rules need to be changed, have at this stage taken a view that the Act as it's drafted is probably sufficient to address abusive conduct by players in the markets, and generally we do not expect too much regulatory changes from an Act perspective to deal with digital markets. So that's in a nutshell, I think, where South Africa is at the moment. I think there's no doubt that there's been a lot of interaction with fellow regulators, both on the African continent and abroad. South Africa's Competition Act is largely inspired by Europe, which is why it's going to be so helpful to get the thoughts from Trevor and Mark. And in answering the question whether the rules need to change, whether the law needs to change, we know, of course, there have been several developments in Europe. But before we turn to Trevor and Mark and get their views, it would be helpful perhaps for Raphael and Florence from a Kenyan and Nigerian perspective, for you to give us perhaps a synopsis of where your respective agencies are at in terms of developing and formulating their competition policies to address the unique challenges posed by digital markets. Obviously, the Nigerian FCCPC is a younger agency, but it's certainly come on streams and not shied away from tackling the issues, whether this be merger control, cartel conduct. The agency's conducted dawn raids and has been very, very active, and I think has made tremendous strides in a very short space of time. The agency has also published very comprehensive guidelines and regulations, albeit not necessarily on digital markets. We know that's also on the table. But Florence, I'd be very much keen and interested to hear where Nigeria, what approach the FCCPC is likely to take in respect of digital markets. And then, of course, we have Raphael Mburu from the Kenyan Competition Authority. Kenya is obviously a very well-established agency on the continent. After South Africa, probably the most active agency over the years. And I know, Raphael, the CAK has grappled with competition policy in digital markets.